Francine, you know I only laugh at 2.5 Men. Charlie Sheen sleeps with whores, then has breakfast with a fat child. It's funny just talking about it.
2.5 Men has been one of my favourite shows since I was Jake's age, and the crude double entendres went over my head just as they went over his.
I heard Mom say the reason Uncle Charlie gets into so much trouble is because he thinks with his little head. It's not that little.
Despite its overwhelming success in the ratings, 2.5 Men was kind of a punching bag for critics and comedy snobs alike. Not to the extent of Chuck Lorre's next show, The Big Bang Theory, but much like Big Bang, it was easy to dismiss 2.5 Men as lowest common denominator entertainment.
Hey, what's the cast of 2.5 Men doing here?
Well, you're always saying our show sucks. Let's see yours.
But I don't think people give this show enough credit. In its early seasons, yes, it peddled in chauvinistic humor and crass punchlines, but it also had an underlying sweetness that was really refreshing and endearing.
It's okay, Dad.
Charlie would constantly make fun of Alan for being a mooch who doesn't pay rent, but it was clear that deep down he really loved his brother and would let him stay at his house for as long as he needed. The heartwarming uncle-nephew relationship with Jake brought out a softer side of Charlie. When Alan and Jake first moved in, Charlie was a shallow, carefree bachelor with a superficial lifestyle revolving entirely around booze, cigars, and sleazy sex. But as he spent more and more time with his brother and nephew, he became a compassionate, loving family man. And yes, sometimes Charlie, and to a lesser extent Alan, would say or do things that bordered on misogynistic. And taken out of context, that might not look great. But that's ignoring the fact that their acid-tongued mother Evelyn and their tough-as-nails housekeeper Bertha were always there to put them in their place.
So, you like making fun of girls with big boobs.
For its first 4 or 5 seasons, 2.5 Men was a great TV comedy with lovable characters and no shortage of fresh story ideas to put them in. But around season 6-ish, the show began to devolve into the crass one-note sitcom its critics had always dismissed it as. Charlie's softer side had been completely eradicated and there was no underlying sweetness in the show's bedroom farce storylines. And Charlie Sheen's worsening substance abuse problems became more and more apparent as he dozed through his scenes and delivered his lines with all the passion and liveliness of a bad SNL host reading off cue cards.
Dear Inspected by number 94, it is with a heavy heart that I write to you. The zipper you signed off on has snagged my ball sack.
But those last few seasons with Charlie looked like comedy gold compared to the 4 interminable seasons that followed Charlie's departure. When creator Chuck Lorre had finally had enough of Sheen's antics, he not only fired the actor and continued the series without him, he brought his grudge against Sheen to the screen with all the subtlety of a schoolyard bully. In the season 9 premiere, Lorre reveals that Charlie has been gruesomely killed after being hit by a speeding train, and turns the funeral of this beloved character that audiences had been following for almost a decade into a cruel joke. Lorre has Charlie's ex-lovers show up to sneer over his mangled corpse, even the ones he broke up with on good terms. And rather than having Alan grieve over the devastating loss of the brother who took him in at the lowest point in his life, Lorre just has him express unbridled glee over inheriting the Malibu beach house that Charlie's let him live in for free for years. This wasn't Charlie Harper's funeral, it was Lorre's smug, one-sided revenge against Charlie Sheen. After seemingly getting all of the spite out of his system in the funeral scene, Lorre sets about setting up a new post-Charlie premise for the show. But 2.5 Men was specifically designed as a vehicle for Charlie Sheen's public persona and comedic talents. It was never going to work as well without him. It was like trying to make Seinfeld work without Jerry, or trying to make Everybody Loves Raymond work without Raymond. It was a pointless endeavor to begin with, and killing off Charlie in such an obviously vindictive way just left a sour taste. But for the sake of discussion, let's humor them. The plan was to replace Charlie with Walden Schmidt, a lackadaisical tech billionaire played by Ashton Kutcher, who buys Charlie's house after being kicked out by his wife and inexplicably allows Alan, a perfect stranger, to keep living in the guest room. Walden was basically Charlie 2.0, rich, handsome, happy-go-lucky, but with all the somewhat problematic traits removed. Walden wasn't a drinker, he wasn't a gambler, and he wasn't a man whore. This made Walden a more clean-cut, family-friendly character than Charlie, but it also made him a far less interesting character. Part of the fun in Two and a Half Men's early years was watching Charlie's reckless behavior yield hilarious consequences. Walden was just a nice guy, so he didn't come into nearly as much conflict, and as a result the show became boring. Kutcher shared okay enough chemistry with John Cryer, but it was nothing compared to Cryer's chemistry with Sheen. Kutcher and Cryer were believable as friendly acquaintances, but Cryer and Sheen were believable as brothers, which was much more fun to watch. Kutcher's tenure as the lead of Two and a Half Men dragged out for 4 long years, half as long as Sheen's tenure, and within about 10 episodes it was practically unwatchable. The Walden Years weren't a complete disaster. There were a handful of decent storylines in there. The introduction of Charlie's long-lost daughter Jenny, a hard-drinking, cigar-chomping womanizer played by the great Amber Tamblyn, brought some of Charlie's edge back into the mix. And the final season storyline of Walden and Alan adopting and co-parenting a little boy returned to the show's original premise. But mostly you had to sit through a stoned Walden's discount Beavis and Butthead banter, or trudge through some weird multi-episode storyline like Walden coming up with a fake name and pretending to be a financially unstable average Joe to see if he could woo a woman with his personality alone. That storyline goes on for several episodes, with Walden moving into the woman's apartment under the alias Sam Wilson, and it's just creepy.
I love you, whether I'm Sam Wilson or Walden Schmidt.
Well, good for you. Unfortunately, I have no idea who Walden Schmidt is. You know what? This whole time, I thought he was the douche. Turns out, you're the douche.
After 4 years that felt like 40 years, Two and a Half Men finally ended its run with the 2-part finale of Course He's Dead. There are plenty of controversial series finales that have been named among the worst. How I Met Your Mother's final episode killed off the mother we'd spent 9 years waiting for in a throwaway line. Dexter's final episode has a sudden hard left pivot that turns its serial killer killing vigilante into a grizzled mountain man. The Sopranos' final episode is a pretty satisfying finale up until the notorious cut to black that had viewers worrying their TVs had broken at a crucial moment. And the Seinfeld finale was so polarizing that Larry David built the entire finale of his next series around addressing and rectifying that polarized response. But those finales were at least made with good intentions. None of them had the contempt for their audience or the complete lack of fucks given that the Two and a Half Men finale had. For the final episode of Two and a Half Men, Laurie was less interested in concluding the story he'd spent 12 years telling and leaving his beloved characters in a good place, and more interested in dusting off his one-sided feud with Charlie Sheen for one last fuck you. And honestly, it felt like as much of a fuck you to the audience who stuck with this show through thick and thin for over a decade as it did a fuck you to Sheen. After a brief previously on recap going back to season 9, the opening scene of the finale reveals that Charlie isn't dead after all. Rose has been keeping him in a well in her basement like Buffalo Bill for 4 years. It's really unnerving to hear the studio audience laughing hysterically, presumably at the request of the producers, over this disturbing reveal.
Lunchtime. Don't give me that look. It needs to eat.
Because it's really not funny. Whether you love Charlie or hate him, this gag is just creepy. Even Rose had her limits. She's not Buffalo Bill. At her absolute worst, she's Sandra Bernhard in The King of Comedy. This opening scene establishes what an uncomfortable experience this finale will be. It's a perfect metaphor for Chuck Lorre's callous treatment of his audience. As the episode gets going, Alan receives a letter informing him that $2.5 million worth of Charlie's music royalties remain unclaimed. If Alan can get his hands on that money, he'll finally be able to move out of Walden's house, but he needs to produce the death certificate in order to claim the royalties as Charlie's next of kin. As it turns out, Charlie has no death certificate, and Walden can't find a record of Charlie's death anywhere online, so they begin to suspect that he's still alive. Early on in the finale, Walden looks right at the camera and says, "I can't wait for this to be over."
I can't wait for this to be over.
Story-wise, this line is a reference to Walden looking forward to finally getting rid of the house guest that's been mooching off him for 4 years. But the fact that it's delivered directly to camera suggests there's a not-so-subtle subtext to this line. As it turns out, it wasn't just the audience who found these last few seasons unbearable. Even the people making the show were sick of it. It makes you wonder why they even bothered. Obviously the answer is money, and granted, I was one of the suckers who kept watching a show they couldn't stand, ultimately generating the ad revenue that encouraged Warner Brothers to keep renewing the show. But if it's a miserable endeavor for everyone involved on both sides of the screen, then what's the fucking point? There's keeping a popular TV show going past its prime because it's still profitable, and then there's this. I've never seen an over-the-hill sitcom actually plead with its own audience for the whole torturous ordeal to finally be over. Anyway, Charlie starts sending menacing packages and veiled threats to Alan and Evelyn, promising payback for, well, it's not really clear what. If Charlie Harper had really been trapped in a well for 4 years and he somehow managed to escape, he wouldn't want to hurt Alan. He'd seek out his family's help, bringing his captor to justice. He often complained about Alan's freeloading and took plenty of opportunities to criticize his mother's shaky parenting, but it was always clear that deep down he loved both of them. And if he made it out of that well after 4 years of torture, he'd be more than happy to see them. This arbitrary revenge storyline just seems to have been designed to fit Laurie's narrative that Charlie Sheen is evil and vindictive. But I bet Charlie Sheen hadn't thought about Chuck Lorre in years by the time 2.5 Men limped to the finish line. It was Laurie who decided to abandon all his established storylines to reopen his feud with Sheen in the finale. When it becomes clear that Charlie is still alive, Rose stops by to explain what really happened after she and Charlie went to France. And then the episode takes a truly bizarre turn with a cartoon segment animated in the creepiest animation style imaginable. Honestly, the nightmare dance sequence in Dumbo was less unsettling than this. When Rose knocks over a pot of sugar, Charlie's nose turns into a vacuum to hoover it all up. When Rose catches Charlie in bed with a stereotypical French maid and a stereotypical French mime, it's also revealed that he's been fucking a goat that smokes cigarettes. And it was the goat that got hit by the train while it was trying to protect its lover. And to top it all off, the end of this animated segment defiles one of Warner Brothers Animation's greatest icons, as it has Porky Pig jump out of the well in a bra and knickers to declare, "That's all, folks." What in the actual fuck were they thinking with this animated sequence? Throughout the whole episode, the writers are very judgmental about Charlie Sheen's drug use, but what the fuck were they on when they came up with this? And what's even worse is that Charlie's family don't bat an eye as Rose tells this whole horrifying story about imprisoning and torturing their long-lost loved one. When Rose reveals she's been keeping Charlie in a dungeon in her basement for 4 years, they're more surprised that she found a house in Sherman Oaks with a dungeon in the basement. Rose insinuates that she regularly drugged and raped Charlie during those 4 years, and his mom and brother don't even make a passing remark about it. Arnold Schwarzenegger makes a random, out-of-the-blue cameo as a detective that Alan and Walden report Charlie's threats to. Arnold provides a summary of the entire series from beginning to end in a scene that gets way too meta.
Now, if I can offer you a word of advice, I would consider wrapping this whole thing up.
What do you mean?
The kids, the girls, the beach house. I mean, this whole thing has been going on way too long.
Yeah, a lot of people have been saying that.
Haters gonna hate.
It's one thing to have the occasional wink at the audience, but this scene is so aggressively self-aware that it doesn't actually make any sense as a conversation between a detective and two people reporting a crime. Alan says his son got dumber over the years because it was funnier. Walden says he tried to kill himself, wandered onto Charlie's deck, and bought the house on the spot because it seemed like a good idea at the time. The detective says it's time to end this whole thing because it's been going on for far too long. This scene only makes sense as Chuck Lorre using these three characters as a mouthpiece to point out the laziness of his own writing to an audience that's well aware of how lazy his writing has gotten. There is one moment in this finale that I actually like, and it's when Angus T. Jones returns for one last scene as Jake. Jones had ducked out of the series due to his moral objections to its humor, but he came back to share the stage with his on-screen father one last time. This is the best scene in the episode because it's the only part that actually feels well-intentioned and wholesome. The rest of the finale is cynical and mean-spirited, but Jake's last scene is actually really sweet. He's just as lovably naive and immature as he was when he first moved into Charlie's house, and it's nice to see him reconnect with his dad after being away for a couple of years. It leaves Jake in a good place, having been sent $250,000 by Charlie that he turned into $2.5 million at a craps table in Vegas. Plus, this scene has the only fourth wall-breaking moment in the finale that actually works. After Jake enjoys some juvenile wordplay about playing craps, Walden quips,
"Amazing that you've made so much money with such stupid jokes."
At which point Jones and his two co-stars turn to the camera with a knowing smirk. This is less fuck you for watching and more, isn't it fun that we all share the same goofy sense of humor? The finale could have used a lot more of that. There's a montage of Alan and Walden calling all their exes, which is what you're supposed to do when you're diagnosed with an STD, not when you think you're about to get murdered. And the detective calls to tell them they've apprehended Charlie, although it turns out to be Christian Slater. And that brings us to the absolutely baffling final scene of 2.5 Men. Alan, Walden, and Bertha all sit out on the deck smoking cigars and see a helicopter carrying a grand piano. Charlie, or rather a Charlie look-alike shot from behind, walks up to the front door and rings the doorbell. And then the helicopter drops the piano on his head, crushing him in an instant. And then the camera pulls back to show Chuck Lorre sitting in his little director's chair. He turns back to the camera and says, "Winning," and then another piano is dropped on his head, killing him. And these two smashed pianos sit on the 2.5 Men backlot for a few seconds before the end credits roll. What the fuck? I mean, really, what the fuck? This is how he chooses to end his beloved sitcom of 12 years? I guess you can give it points for being unpredictable, but this is an ending that no one would predict because you wouldn't expect them to be batshit crazy enough to end the series this way. When they were coming up with the ending to Game of Thrones, they bent over backwards trying to come up with an ending no one could predict, and they ended up coming up with an ending that didn't really make sense. But this is even worse than that. At least that was an ending to a story. Chuck Lorre just nuked the fourth wall and put himself in front of the camera for the sake of getting some pointless win against Charlie Sheen in a childish rivalry that was already 4 years in the rearview mirror.
Winning.
2.5 Men, for better or worse, was a pillar of my childhood. The Harpers felt like family, and this finale felt like a bitter slap in the face. If it didn't completely undermine what a wonderful series this once was, and openly insult the audience who kept it on the air for so many years, I'd probably admire this finale for how wickedly demented it is. That's probably why the finale got surprisingly positive reviews from critics who'd been lambasting 2.5 Men throughout its entire run. The finale freely shits all over the fan base that these critics had already been shitting on for years. But these critics didn't owe those fans anything, whereas I feel like Chuck Lorre did. And as one of those fans, I felt pretty fucking shortchanged when my beloved Charlie Harper, who I'd watched grow from a carefree playboy into a caring family man, had a fucking piano dropped on his fucking head.
Winning.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you liked the video. Remember to like and subscribe and click on the little bell. And also seize the day and call your mom and be kind to yourself.